Well, I wanted to take this time and say, Philip Anderson, thank you so much for agreeing to be part of Aaron's opinion and speaking to me today. I want to actually get started by letting you know how I found out about you. I believe that one of the guests who contributes a lot here to Aaron's opinion is a Tunisian man who happens to be blind, who's been on our show many, many times, and he loves suggesting guests. So he said, Aaron, you should talk to Philip Anderson. And he has this podcast that you should learn more about. And once I heard your voice, I got to tell you something. I love hearing you talk. I love your accent, your delivery, the way that you talk is just so beautiful. I could listen to your voice anytime to hear any content. You have a beautiful way of talking. I just love it. Definitely reminds me of BBC, and it's just a perfect way to talk. Of course, I lived in England for 3 months, by the way, so I'm very familiar in a sense with the beautiful British English. But anyway, as I start any interview, I'll start yours just the same by saying, welcome. And my first question, and you can take this in any direction in the universe, but who is Philip Anderson?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Aaron, for agreeing to have me on your podcast. It's an absolute pleasure, and I appreciate all the compliments you opened up with, the checks in the post. Yes, who is Philip Anderson? That's a very interesting question. It's not one I've been asked very often, and I think it's good to know who and what we stand for. And I think that's, wait me a second. I think that's an absolutely fabulous question, and I'm very pleased you've asked it, because it's important we all know who we are, what we stand for, what we represent. And I wonder how many people actually give credence or consideration to who we really are as people. Because there's an old quote which says, we're all equal at birth. It's our values and virtues that divide us. And I think that's a good thing. I think if we were all automatons, the planet would be absolutely boring. But quite frankly, and quite sadly, we're living in an age now where multiple opinions are unacceptable. Everybody has to follow the current narrative, or else you're seen as a social misfit. You're an outcast. And for me, that's unfair. On the one hand, we're told we have freedom of speech. And on the other hand, we're told that we have to agree with the current narrative. And even though they say we don't have to agree with it, intimidation is used to determine what is spoken, what is taught. And that, for me, is unacceptable. If I wish to hold a different opinion to you, I think that's absolutely within my right as a human being. I don't see why intimidation should be used to determine how we think, what we say, think and feel, what is taught in the classroom. I think that's wholly unacceptable. It takes away individuality. We've all had different experiences in our lives. We've all been brought up differently. And our values reflect that. To have that denied us by certain lobbyists, certain people in power, elitist movements, for me, that is an infringement on human rights, because that's saying to me, their way is the only way, and our way isn't. So, what do I stand for? Well, I hope you've gleaned a little bit from that I'm a person who is open-minded, but is also very assured of his own opinion, of his own beliefs. I try to say I'm an all-encompassing individual. I am when it comes to certain things. I'm quite tolerant. But the one thing I will not have is people saying to me, my opinions count for nothing because they go contrary to the current narrative. So, I represent justice. I represent tolerance. I also represent diversity. And I also represent love. I think the one thing that bonds us together as human beings is love. And without it, we have nothing. We are nothing. One thing Socrates said, if we want to find out who we are, we must learn to think for ourselves. How many people actually think for themselves these days when they're so governed by what other people think? I often come into contact with people who are forever seeking validation for their own decisions, which suggests to me they're unsure, they're insecure in some way. And I've noticed it amongst not just people with disabilities, but people from all walks of life, where they've been brought up in accordance with the current narrative and not been allowed to explore who they are, how everything they have learned fits in to their current thinking, how it corroborates with their own virtues, values. And for us to survive and be, as a whole human being, holistically, I suppose, we must learn to understand who we are and what we stand for. If we're forever following the crowd, how do you really ever get to know who you are? You're putting your trust into somebody else? Well, what will that lead to? What happens if that person decides to change tact? Well, you could end up falling into a very serious trap. And by your own admission, by following the crowd, what we're saying to people, or what we're saying to ourselves, we are incapable of change. We are incapable of change. And we've seen it so often. In psychology, they call this abdication syndrome. It's where we go back to a childlike state, where we sort of disown ourselves, throw off all responsibility, throw caution to the wind, and make our existence somebody else's responsibility. Imagine when you're children and something doesn't quite go your way. You've often had a parent there picking up the pieces, solving your problems. But how does that teach you to solve your own problems? And that's the same when we are growing up. If you're not taught to take calculated risks, then unfortunately where that will lead you is it will lead you down a very insecure pathway where you are incapable of making decisions for yourself, for deciding what's right and what is wrong. It may be all right for some of the smaller things that you come up against in life, but what you wear in the morning, what you choose to eat, when you choose to eat, they all may be very simple things. But what about some of the bigger issues in life? And that's the most important thing. And if you're relying on somebody else to decide those for you, then really you are not living your life as an individual. You're living your life through somebody else. That's part of what I stand for. I'm a great believer in being ourselves. Somebody once said, stop following the crowd. Stop trying to be other people. They're taken. Be yourself. I don't know how many people have grown up or were educated at specialist schools. Were you, Aaron? Did you go to a specialist school as a visually impaired person?
I did not. Thank you for asking. I was mainstreamed because my parents knew, or it was my parents' opinion, that the only way for a blind child to one of the most effective ways for a blind child to be successful is to first be educated and educated in a mainstream setting. But that's our opinion. Mm-hmm.
Well, you did say it's Aaron's opinion.
That's true, but thank you. There are a wide range. I listened to every word you said so far, and I agree with you. I agree with 100% of what you're saying. But it is important to talk about it because there is a debate in the blindness and disability community about should there even be specialized schools, as we say in the States, schools for the blind, right? There's a huge debate about that in the community. In my opinion, well, actually, you're the guest. What's your opinion about that, if you would like?
Well, quite frankly, I think when we look back in history and look back at what's been achieved as a result of specialist education, I think that's all we've got to go on is a track record. For some who have attended these institutions, they've come out fairly educated, but not prepared to live in the real world.
Precisely.
They end up feeling as though they are incapable of living in what we call the real world. And they almost become socially inept as individuals. And they've been taught in special schools that they are special. And they grow up with an assumed mentality. Life owes them a living. Well, I'm afraid it doesn't.
Mm-hmm. You are correct.
And so many people who go out in this wide world expect the government will support me. I don't need to get a job. Well, to me, that is so far from what life is really about. It does no good to anybody's social and mental and physical well-being by being an automaton subservient to a system. Because if you are subservient to a system, then it's not your responsibility to challenge it because you agreed to subscribe to it. They set the moral code. They set the standards. They set the precedent. You're basically saying, look after me. Well, you can't keep on complaining. If you've agreed, that is the way you want to go.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, and this is exactly what I try to teach my students and try to teach other blind people here in the States. Your perception is 100% accurate. Unfortunately, we have, and I do think not to come up with excuses because I don't tolerate those, but I think it's fair to say that probably the lives of people with disabilities have been adversely affected by the pandemic, just like anyone's life has. So I think the attitude and the psyche of blind people in the United States has really, really been affected by the pandemic and the hopelessness of what that has caused for the psyche of all the world, of the citizens
do you
of
think
our world.
Then, out of that, looking at that, do you think all the pandemic's done is sought to highlight the volatility of people with disabilities?
I think it most definitely has. I think your assessment is correct, and that's exactly what has been noticed. I have been noticing the same, that blind people who go to schools for the blind, in my opinion, yes, sometimes they are educated, but almost all the time they are not prepared. And you said it beautifully. And I do not wish in any sense of the imagination to say that schools for the blind are detrimental and that people who work at those schools are bad people. They are not. Schools are great. And some of the people who work at those schools for the blind are great. But the fact is, it's not so much about that it's a school for the blind. What it's really about is that you're separating people. You're getting people into a group, and basically academically, what this is called is othering. And
It's
this
separatist.
it's called that, and it's called academically. It's also called othering, where
Yeah.
you get a group of people and you say, well, you're different because we said so. So what that does then is, unfortunately, we have a nation of people in the United States that a lot of sighted people won't work and a lot of blind people won't work. Now,
It's creating divisions, actually, isn't it, in society?
well, it's
With by
what
its
it
own
has
definition.
done. Well, what it
Yeah.
has done is it has created a nation of people who won't work, who are
Yes.
willing to be, who are willing to be, who are willing to be submissive to the state.
Yeah.
And I do not understand that mentality, so I'm not going to contest it or defend it in any direction or sense of the imagination, because that's not how I think. So I can't, it's hard for me to relate to it because I don't understand it. But I will
I'm
forewarn
interested,
you.
Aaron.
Sure, sure.
I'm very interested without cutting in
Sure.
on you
No,
because
no, please cut in. Please interrupt me, please.
we have, obviously, we are divided by the pond, as we like to say. And what we
Indeed.
have over here is a welfare state. And it is here to bolster people who supposedly are incapable of supporting themselves. But I think it's created an assumed or a something for nothing mentality. It does exist, and I think it should know it. Well, should it exist for people who really need it? But it's become open to abuse. And I wondered, how easy is it? What do you have to be or to qualify for state support as a person with a disability in the States?
Indeed. You
What's
have
the
to go-
criteria?
The criteria is you go to your Social Security office, is what it's called, and you say, hi, I have a disability, I need benefits. And then they interview you, and they look at your credentials. You do need a doctor's note proving that you have a disability. Of course, as you probably heard, there was a man in Florida who pretended to be blind for 15 years to get benefits.
No, I didn't hear that.
Well,
What did he do? Walk around with his eyes closed for 24 hours a day or something? I mean, what was the...
well, he was a very talented blind man, Philip, because you know what? He drove a car like a blind person to work and to home each day. I'm very impressed with him. I wish I could do that as a blind person. Eventually, his wife turned him in. So either either he needed to choose a better wife or he needed to not fake being blind. But either way, he ended up, I honestly forget what happened. I'm pretty sure he was fined. He may have served time in a penitentiary setting, but I do not know that. I do not know for sure. But suffice it to say, we have had a lot of people who have taken advantage of the system. And in that case, we really only have the system to blame, because if you're good enough to trick the system and the system falls for it, well, quite frankly, it's kind of the system's fault. Of course,
It's a victim of its own existence, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really the fault. Philosophically, it's the fault of the system for allowing someone to fake a disability. It's also the ethical fault of the person for faking a disability. But, as I say, karma's a bitch and karma's a coming. And for the people who don't understand how that works, well, karma will come to you. Either way, if you do good, you'll be helped. If you hurt others, you'll be hurt. But so few people understand that we ended up with a nation of people who won't work or can't work or don't want to work. So really,
in terms of the amount of money that's paid, though, in terms of the amount of money that's paid to individuals, in terms of the amount of money that's paid to the individual, who has a disability, how does that fare, say, to the average sort of salary earned?
Well, the answer is
person?
extremely low. If you want to live a life of Social Security, you are living a life of a hand to mouth. I think the expression is hand to mouth, hand to mouth existence. You would be realistically, you would be living with a family member or your parents for the rest of your, I mean, you wouldn't be able to have an independent life. The intention of the system is to make sure you are not independent. So of course it's set that way intentionally, but we have a very high percentage of people who have real disabilities, who have fake disabilities, who can't work, who won't work, and all of them are benefiting from the welfare state. So I blame the flaws of the state system itself more than I actually blame the dishonesty.
I didn't
And
realize it was that bad in America because I always believed you had to almost pay your way in America. You had to pay your own health care. We call it national insurance over here, which sort of pays for your state pensions or any sickness or what have you, should you become unemployed. And it entitles you to certain benefits if you should, lose your job. But the fact that in this country, the welfare state is paid now in such a way, we call it the Department for Work and Pensions, I think they call it, and it pays out money to people who are disabled, for want of a better expression, which I want to come on and talk about in a moment, about those terminologies and labels. It almost matches your average primary school teacher's salary. So at £28,000 to £30,000 a year. The government said they were going to cap it at £28,000. £28,000 is a substantial amount of money. You're talking of almost $50,000 per year.
Well, Americans would take £28,000 a year then, because American people cannot possibly make that much with benefits.
So what would an average benefit be over a year? Okay. Then, do you know?
So, well, I don't know the average. I can give you some ideas. I think I'm making, of course, I work, so I make a little bit less. I'm given a little bit less of the benefit because I'm willing to work and willing to admit that I work. So they calculate it in. There's a formula. I think I'm making around in the 700s, 6 or 700s. I honestly, I forget, but I'm making in the 6 or 700s. But I think the cap now, no, I forget now, because there's a cap where some people make 800, other people make 1,400. It just depends on the person and their job and the way things are set up. There's all different answers.
So if they were just in receipt of benefit, for example, what sort of a figure are we looking at? An annual figure here would they receive if they were only dependent on state benefit?
Well, indeed, let's just go with most people make around $800 a month. That's probably one of the figures, is 800 a month. So, well, I don't know, 800 times 12 minus taxation. I don't know that number. It's still not really enough to do everything you would want to do and to have all the privileges that you need to have in life to be independent. So
are benefits taxable then in America?
Oh, sure. So anytime I make money, whether it's through my work or anytime the government gives me money, I still at the end of the year have to, tally it up, and then we fill out forms and we tell the government how much we make, and they say, okay, you owe us this amount and we owe you that amount. And then they, God only knows. Money gets passed around, and then they say, okay, start over. And then you just start over for the next year.
Well, there's no actual tax on benefits claimed in this country. Obviously, it's taxed if you earn over a certain limit if you're working. But if you are not, and you were just claiming off the state, relying on the government to fund you, then there's no tax to be paid. And as I'm saying, in this country, benefit can include up to about £28,000, which is what the government said that that they cap it at that figure, which I think people can quite easily live on that as a single person with a disability. That includes their housing benefit. That includes their council tax. So that gets paid for them. There's quite a lot. And so what that does is it takes away the incentive to get off your backside and get a bloody job.
Yeah. So so one of the things is right now, nobody wants to work because in America, people make more money from the government than they do from the jobs.
This is what they do in this country, and something should be done. Because I think at the long term, I think it's storing up problems for the whole of the state, generally. It's no different. People claim,
sure.
oh, it costs more to keep somebody in a prison than it does to keep somebody on the welfare state. But again, is it a good use of public money?
Right. That's the
And
question.
personally,
And no, it's not. And it's clearly, as you're hinting, it's clearly to, as I said before, we have ourselves to blame, but then we also, rightfully so, in some regard, have the state to blame. It's to the state's demise, is my perception. You see, I'm 30 years old, by the way, so that is my perception. That and most of my family and my relatives lived to be in their upper 90s, and several people lived to be 100. So I could easily be around for easily another 50 years, and I would hate to see what we will end up with as a society in 50 years. That it could truly be a horror movie come true. I mean, I think we'll see a society where really nobody does anything, nobody has motivation to work. So
well, I think nature will take care of that, and eventually, if people start falling into that sort of lifestyle, I think they'll end up paying the price for it, because health-wise, if people end up, no longer committing themselves to work, I think physically there will be deleterious effects. I think people will suffer.
Well, why don't as we say on the pipe, don't tell. I already don't tell me. I've been telling people this for years, but nobody will believe me. So maybe they'll believe your beautiful wise voice and your beautiful sense of wisdom that you
Oh,
bring.
don't be sucked in by my platitudes. Go and live it for yourself. That's what I often say. I mean, these are just my views for what they're worth.
Well, they're true. They're true.
They are true views, and I think sometimes these are the conversations that are not had.
Well, I'm honored to be help. I'm honored to help you have the conversation, because
well, I appreciate it,
it's
because
something it's something I need to hear, and it's something that other people need to hear. So I think, I think we were talking a lot in those beautiful emails, and you said that you've done a lot of work as a reporter, doing a lot of different interesting projects. So, of course, if you wouldn't mind, may we, as we say, segue a little, and for you to, if you would like to share with me some of the interesting things that you've done in your career. And you really do sound like you're right from BBC News. So have you worked for BBC News? I just have to ask.
No, I haven't worked for BBC News, but I have worked as a freelancer for the BBC in times gone by. One of the things that I've done is I've done work on national radio and local radio. Started out my sort of time on local radio, which is where I acquired some of my experience. Talking about 30 years ago, near enough. And then there was a big hiatus about, a few years, because I went into the print media. And my experience of the print media was rather interesting, because I always went in to make a difference. I wasn't really a political sort of activist in that sense. I wasn't really campaigning for the rights of people to sort of have their political voice heard. What I was there to is to address some of the humanitarian issues, some of the human issues out there that were really going unheard and going unreported. And I think sometimes if you can use the power of the press to champion a cause and hopefully bring about a result, then for me, that is what we should do. It's difficult in today's mass media, where everything is, you threaten sort of online news, 70% of it's fake. So it's knowing how credible your sources are and how authentic, what the authenticity is of the actual sources of those reports that you're reading. And this is where social media, I think, has really gone completely wrong. It's imploding, really. It's fueling a lot of evil intent out there. I think it's created a very toxic environment. I think it's divided nations, it's divided families. It's been to a lot of people's demise. And I think we used to say that bullying left you when you left the playground. Nowadays it doesn't. And it's there on your mobile phone. It's there on your laptop. It's there on your handheld device, whatever it is you use. and there's just no escape. When I was in print media, the differences that I wanted to make was to try and bring about changes for people, a bit of liberty for people. And sometimes they perhaps may have lacked that initial confidence to get them to the next stage. And my very first article involved a chap who came to me and said that this was my first national piece. I'd been doing a lot of other things for very smaller publications and more niche markets. But this chap approached me and said that he had been refused access into what we have here, the London Marathon. You've probably heard about that, the big run that happens once a year. I don't know how familiar you are with that. And that attracts people from all over the place, all over the country. But it's there to also sort of represent those who are, sort of top athletes as well. And they're the people who are sort of sponsored by some of the top, companies in the country. Be that your, Puma or Nike, whoever decide to sponsor some of these leading athletes. And then you get the general lay people who compete in the race as well. And people go in fancy costume and so on and so forth. And it's a real big day. Some people, I think the record, and I don't know what the fastest time is for completing the London Marathon, but it's 25 miles. So you can work that out because you measure everything in kilometers over there. I don't know, but I'm sure you do. But we do it as 25 miles, which, it's when you're running, it's a lot of work that you have to do to prepare yourself. And they also have disabled athletes as well and disabled competitors. And this chap who approached me hasn't always been disabled. He ended up being disabled through a serious injury. There was an attempt made on his life. He was a police officer, and there was an attempt made on his life, and it almost killed him. But it turned him into a paraplegic. He ended up in a wheelchair. And around about the same sort of time, his wife was suffering with cancer. And his determination to carry on, his resilience is something to be admired. He said to me that when he ended up in a wheelchair, he wasn't going to be beaten by that. And he threw himself wholehearted into fundraising for the cancer charity who had supported his wife. And when she sadly passed away, he had competed in a couple of major runs or marathons in his wheelchair. And we're talking a bog standard mechanical wheelchair here. So he's propelling himself by hand. And the story goes, he's had the same wheelchair for 22, 23 years now. And that wheelchair is raised over, well, he in that wheelchair has raised over £1 million for good causes. He's been recognised by the Queen of England, and he was given a medal for all his services to charity and good causes per se. And when he approached me, he said, "I've been denied access into the London Marathon. Please can you write a story for the national press?" And I saw this as quite an interesting challenge, and to perhaps highlight the injustices that prevail from some of these, organisations governed by people from their ivory towers who have a rather blinkered view. Nothing's going to threaten our cosy little world here, and we will only admit certain people. And by their own very admission, they had committed discrimination in this chap's case. And by that time, the Disability Discrimination Act, which is now morphed into the Equality Act, had not long come into existence. I think it came around about 1995, but it was going to be implemented in stages. And some of those stages, I don't think, which applied to him at the time, hadn't been implemented. But anyway, I set about writing this article. I spent a week interviewing him at different points. And that time we hadn't got things like Zoom as we've got today. So it was a case of the telephone and email. And the one criteria for anybody who entered the London Marathon or wanted to compete in the London Marathon, they had to have competed in another similar marathon. Well, he'd competed in one called the Great North Run, which I think is almost on a par with the London Marathon. And they said that the wheelchair he was in was dangerous. It could cause all sorts of problems for athletes. So we put another slant on that and said the crocodile outfits that some of the contestants are wearing, some of the runners are wearing, are equally dangerous, in fact more so. They can cause all sorts of problems if people were to trip or injure somebody as they were running past them, because some of these costumes did stick out for miles. It seemed like it anyway. And people were dressed up in crocodile outfits. And so once we had put that forward and put a case for inclusion forward in a way that the Ivory Towers folks over at the London Marathon had not really considered, I wrote this article and hopefully had fought his corner. And I sent it to 10 national newspapers, which is the total number of newspapers we had, national newspapers that is, in this country. So we're looking at Murdoch's sort of papers like the Times, the Sun, Daily Mirror, Daily Mail, etc. Guardian, the Telegraph, Spectator, Observer. And I'd faxed everybody a copy of this article over with a covering letter. And I thought this could easily be picked up and run with. And I could end up suffering, losing out, and somebody else actually using this as their article. I should have just sent them a basic press release regarding the story. This is me being a bit wet behind the ears, near enough 20 odd years ago. And anyway, I submitted it. And it was the honesty of this editor from the Times, one of Murdoch's papers. I thought was really good. He contacted me at 5 to 5 on the Thursday afternoon. Love your article, Mr. Anderson. This is absolutely what we need. And as the London Marathon's coming up, I want to get this in on Saturday. And we'll pay you £350 for it, which I was very chuffed about, because at that point I had done work for local radio and I'd received various commissions from poetry publications because I was into literature at that point. And I was running a publishing company for writers and aspiring writers. And that had a worldwide presence at that time. And I was very chuffed. And from there is how I broke then into the BBC, because it was a bit of a stepping stone from there, because they ran with the same story. So again, it was pretty much a piece of cake, a walk in the park. And, I had, within a couple of days of that article appearing in the Times, the chap concerned contacted me and said, "You know what, Philip, that's had the desired effect. They've accepted me into the marathon." That meant more to me than the paycheck of £350.
Of course.
It did. And it still does to this day. And
it should.
And it should, yes. And what was interesting is I that article went into the press on my son's first birthday. So it was almost like my first major stepping stone. It had a dual purpose for me because it was my son's first birthday. It was my first major inroad into print via the national press. And it opened up a whole new door. So it was first for on so many fronts. And I was really touched by it all. And from there on, I was determined that whatever I did, it would be to make a difference, to make people more autonomous, because he's not come back to me and is depending on me to move his life forward for him. That was the only one opening he needed. And he completed the marathon within just over 7 hours in a wheelchair, a manually propelled wheelchair, which I think is an amazing feat. And from there, he's gone on to raise over £1 million for good causes in that same wheelchair. It's covered over, I think he said, over 50,000 miles in it. It's quite a lot pushing by hand, isn't it?
That's an example, that's an example of you doing the right thing in life and you knowing what the right answer is in life. And that person is an example of someone who is on the right track in life.
He is indeed. He could have given up. He could have given up, though, couldn't he? He could have done, having had that huge blow.
Yeah. But that's a great person. Society needs more of those than the people we were talking about before.
Yes.
But I'm very proud of you very proud to hear that you wrote that article. That's something that in the States, it would be a lot harder to get the attention of a journalist to write a positive article. Oftentimes, if a journalist in America writes an article about someone with a disability, it turns into what we call, this is going to upset your stomach a little bit, it's going to sound weird in your stomach. We call it disability porn. And what this is, it's an American concept where you write a great article and you would say something like, oh, Aaron's the greatest thing because he's blind. And that we
we get that here as well,
I see, and there on your side of the pond, do you call it disability porn, or do you have a more drier way of saying it over there?
No, to me, it's purely how can we put this? I'm not altogether sure what the term is nowadays. To me, I class that as just purely positive discrimination.
Yes, it is. Yes,
because
it is a form of discrimination. Of course, it is. That's a form of discrimination.
It's sympathy, as they're playing on. They're playing on the sympathy card. That the only reason how you've got where you are is because of your disability, for example. So, Is it on merit, or have you got there because of your disability?
Right, but the trick to know is that people don't understand the difference.
No, they don't.
The problem why it's so evil is that your average person doesn't see the difference.
No.
The answer is that you get where you are in life because you decided to be a success. But your average chap, as you like to say over there, your average chap doesn't understand that. So, it's a very, very, very profound problem in the United States. And we do have, in my opinion, a severe problem of discrimination. But, thinking back to something you said before you told the beautiful story, which is true, your beautiful experience with the article, you said that you think that social media is evil. And you're absolutely right. But here's the good news. The only silver lining that I can find with it is that actually it's easier than ever before to create content that does the right thing, because I can choose to be a success and to produce successful episodes that help others. I can also choose not to feed into the evil that some areas of social media has gone to. So you're right. but it also is super easy to do the right thing because we can reach the whole world and help if we want.
You can,
So
but how do
it
you
goes
get
both
beyond all
ways.
those barriers, though, Aaron? How do you get beyond? Because
Well, mainly,
it's like swimming in a
sure.
minefield. It's like being in a minefield, and it's full of
Right.
explosives here, there, and everywhere. And your job is to navigate your way through all of that,
Hmm.
and hopefully find a sympathetic or a determining ear and the right audience, because it's difficult to know what's true and what isn't true. And even people who are very trained social mediaites say it's very difficult to determine what is true and what isn't, because a lot of it is just written
Yeah.
rather than spoken.
Oh yeah, and about
And
the
that
fake.
makes it very difficult because people can misinterpret what, things that are written.
Indeed. And what you said about fake news, I think you were being very liberal when you said that 70% of news is fake. I'll tell you the truth. About 95% of it's fake.
Okay, perhaps I'm being very liberal. Perhaps I'm being very generous here.
Yeah, it would be you would be very polite to say 70% is fake, but I'm just not as nice as you. So I'll just tell the truth. About 95% of the media that is circulating around the
What
universe
does
is
that
fake.
say then? So what does that say? So
it
how do you?
shows it shows that people are not willing to be critical thinkers, because if people were critical thinkers they would be able to easily tell, oh, that's fake, oh, what a load of malarkey, what a load of nonsense. They would be able to think for themselves. But it all goes back to how you opened this beautiful conversation with someone's willingness to either think for themselves or submit to the state that holds them. It's all fundamentally, this is why this is such a fascinating conversation for me, and I hope it's fascinating for you and the listener too. But I'm really loving this, Philip, because it really is true. If you're an active thinker, you would know to be successful, and you would realize how there's so much fake stuff out there. But we live in this universe where sometimes I know this sounds harsh, but it just feels like you and I might be the only people who are thinking, who are actually using the brilliant mind that God gave us. And so it's until more people listen to you, until more people maybe listen to me, we're going to keep having this problem. Yeah.
I think that's possibly true. And the one thing, what I would love to do is what I would love to see is for more people to start thinking for themselves, thinking outside the box. If you don't if you don't lose sight of the shore, you'll never ever be able to swim to the other side. And you've
Yes.
got to be able to lose sight of that shore. But the deep blue sea is basically outside of people's comfort zones. And so many people are prepared to sort of stand in the shallows and gaze out to sea and dream. Well, what do they say? Losers dream in bed, winners dream in the day. And I think, it's not always about success, it's about value.
Sure.
And I think if we always just striving for success, then we can lose sight of really what we're about. I accept, sometimes, I think Socrates said, or was it Aristotle was talking about people who are treading the broad path are very quick to throw stones at those who are advocating an alternative route, because it's easier for people in numbers, great numbers, to start jeering at people who come up with an alternative, who challenge the status quo, who go contrary to the current narrative. And I think, it's good that people, because otherwise we'll end up finding that we don't end up making progress. It will just be a battle of minds. It'll just be a battle of strength, just general strength of character, and that's all. And nothing will ever be achieved by it, because it won't produce anything great as a consequence. If good ideas or decent thinking is just shot down, I don't quite get it, because I was talking to somebody not so long ago, and I said, one thing I struggle with is this whole issue of gender neutrality. And I'm sure people have founded views for voicing their opinions on what it all is and why it's so important to them. They don't fit into the binaries, etc. But we are, I think, on the surface of that, looking at a minority, not the majority. But I'm not allowed to have an opposing view on it, according to society. I have to accept it. Why? Why should I? Why can't I be entitled to my view? Why is it, when it comes to these type of conversations, all people want to hear is their own views been reflected back at them? Absolute rubbish. That goes back to this whole point about using intimidation to determine what is taught, what is spoken. Well, that to me is not the way it should be. If a person with a disability wants to get a point across successfully, prove it. Don't shout about it. Demonstrate it. Actions speak louder than words. People can sit on their arses all day, waxing about, their grievances and what they feel is wrong with the system, and end up doing fuck all about it. So if you've got anything you feel strongly about, that you don't feel is right in your life, do something about it. Be active. Remember that.
Yeah.
It paints a picture paints 1,000 words. And I think you've just got to demonstrate that picture. So if people can then see by example, and that really speaks volumes. And if you are struggling to, become more autonomous in your thinking, then one of the greatest things you can do is to start sitting down and just evaluating some of your strengths and weaknesses. Think back to a time when you did something in your life where you felt completely and utterly you. When it wasn't influenced by other people, when it wasn't been tarnished by some other body's thinking, etc. When you did something in your life and you thought, this is where I feel, that was me. I really felt at ease with myself. I was content with myself. And that's one way to determine it. If you can reflect on that, use that as your springboard. And that will then help to propel you forward, because then you can start fashioning your own life on that. When you wake up in the morning and you're getting dressed, who do you see in your mind? In other words, who are you getting dressed for? Yourself? Or the people you think you may meet when you're out and about? Who do you want to impress? Well, how many people spend that time impressing other people? And again, these are the sorts of things that I try and sort of encourage people as I'm going along the way, about being who they are. And that's just one thing. If people have carers coming into their homes to support them, does the carer take control of when you eat, what you should buy, what clothes would best suit you because you aren't capable of making a decision? You're basically just a living robot, if that's the case. Particularly if you have the ability to do it for yourself. I'm not talking of people here who are, almost incapable because of, things that are way beyond their control. I'm not saying that. I accept that not everybody's at that point in their journey. But there are those who have sadly had all their rights, their thinking rights, denied them. And I would love to see more people returning to this autonomous way of living, because that's where we've gone completely wrong as a system. We've actually allowed ourselves to be governed and controlled and ruled to the point now where in society they reckon for every leader there are 99 subjects. That is quite a statistic. Now, okay, we wouldn't want to be having too many leaders in the world, but it depends whether or not The leaders are there to try and control the masses. I think, yes, we can't affect the fact that there is a system in place. We're never going to, abolish what has already been created, but you can create a life for yourself. It's like we're all swimming in the same ocean. We don't all have to go in the same direction. We have to abide by the rules and regulations of it, but we can still live a very independent and fulfilled life without being too heavily reliant on the system and controlled by the system. You can just go through the motions and just abide by the basics. It's not saying you become a criminal. It doesn't make you antisocial either. I mean, you'll know if you're independent. As if, if you ask yourself, well, I've got a partner, I've got friends, do I need them? There's a difference between do you need them, can you live without them? If you're going to have friends, but don't abuse them. You don't have to be needy and depend on them for your existence. Because that's just abusing other people's rights as human beings. It's like you've got, 15 plugs and you're trying to put them into a 5-plug socket. You're putting too much pressure on the supply. And it rather has adverse effects. And one final thing I would like to share with people, if I may, Aaron, is my Independence for Life project, because that's partly what really has been behind a lot of this conversation today. And Independence for Life I set up to try and give back this autonomy to those who have been marginalised by difference. And I like to think that's quite an interesting turn of phrase, because they've been marginalised by difference because society is set up in such a way that it does end up pigeonholing people, labelling people, putting them into boxes. The education system is certainly guilty of that. How you perform in your exams at school or university will determine, possibly, if you allow it, and you believe it, where you end up. But you don't have to follow that path. You don't have to believe it. I actually decided that when I was growing up, there was no such thing as job security for people with disabilities. Most people said, well, the state will keep you. Well, that wasn't for me. And I was determined to set myself up in business, go out and study, learn to be a survivor. And I tell you what, when I was making my own decisions and deciding what I bought, what I ate, who I visited, when I visited them, what my job career was, what path I wanted to follow, what skills I was going to deploy. Tell you what, it did wonders for my well-being, physical and mental. And I felt so content within myself. I didn't go striving after things because I'd actually felt I'd achieved what I wanted. I was where I wanted to be in life. And life is for living. They reckon it's so short, but we take so long to live it. Sometimes when we are on our deathbed almost, we'll give $1 million plus to have an extra 10 breaths awarded to us. Well, if when you die, if you can safely say you die with memories rather than just with dreams, then you will have had hopefully a fulfilled life. And Independence for Life is all about helping people to become more autonomous thinkers and to make decisions for themselves and to help them to rediscover who they are. And that's the point of my podcast, Against the Odds Motivational Podcast. Not to be confused with Against the Odds, which is there out in the States, celebrating American heroes. I'm celebrating the unsung heroes, not just here in the UK, but hopefully around the world when it takes off. And it's there to show people that it is possible, despite the odds, for you to make a difference once you take control of your own life.
Absolutely. You guys can click the link in the description for more information about all of that. Of course, at the end of every great episode, I love to tell the guests, and I'll tell you, it was truly an honor to have you on my podcast today. But sadly, you haven't really lost me this easily. You are forever a member of the Aaron's Opinion podcast family. And I intend to have you back anytime you might like. And I'm sure that all of our listeners on all four corners of the globe will love this episode and will be able to feel your love and your kindness and your wisdom that you have. So, of course, I'm going to ask you an easy question because I know that you're going to be able to answer this very simple question. If you can now only ask me only one question to really make me sweat, to see if I'm really worth my salt as a podcaster, what do you really want to know about Aaron Richmond?
I didn't know you were going to ask this question. If you had children and you'd learnt your child had murdered somebody, would you be prepared to live a lie in his defense?
No. No, definitely not. Because like you said before, principles and values are very important. And the value that society shares is that act is wrong. Our values teach us, scripture teaches us, our values are wrong. So it's an easy answer. And that was a very crazy question. No one's ever come up with that one before. I loved that one. And so, no. It's truly been an honor to have you, as I said, and you're always welcome here. I wish you continued success with your podcast and keep up your great work. And thank you for everything you do. I appreciate you and I appreciate your podcast very much. And have a very good evening over there on your side of the pond. All right.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Aaron. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I wish you and all your listeners the same.
Well, very good. All right, everybody. Take care. As we like to say here at Aaron's Opinion, help one person today, help a million people tomorrow.